we're doing well and as a country. If the Fed would ever lower rates, would buy debt for a lot less. It's a shame. This guy, do you ever have a guy that's not a smart person and you're dealing with him and you have to deal? He's not a smart guy. He's worried about inflation. I said, that's right. If there's inflation in 6 months or 9 months, you lower the rates or you raise the rates. You can do whatever you want, Brian, right? So let's say there's rampant inflation, which there's none. You know what there is? There's success. I got a call from Congress last night. Sir, there's a problem. I said, what is it? Money is pouring in. We don't know how to account for it. I said, check the tariffs. $88 billion came in from tariffs. No inflation. And it's going to get even more so. I know what I'm doing. So we have a stupid person, frankly, at the Fed. He probably won't cut today. Europe had 10 cuts, and we had none. And I guess he's a political guy. I don't know. He's a political guy who's not a smart person, but he's costing the country a fortune. So what I'm going to do is, he gets out in about 9 months. He gets fortunately terminated. Biden, I would have never reappointed him. Biden reappointed him. I don't know why that is, but I guess maybe he was a Democrat. I got great advice from Mnuchin on this one. Great advice. But he's done a poor job. So we have no inflation. We have only success. And I'd like to see interest rates get down. Now, Biden did a lot of very short-term debt. So we have short-term debt coming due. And because of this guy's rates, if he'd lowered a point, I'd pay about a point less. Then if he'd lowered 2 points, I'd pay about 2 points less. And that's for 10 years, 12 years, 15 years, 5 years. It's hundreds of billions. It's even trillions of dollars that we're going to lose because of this too late. I call him Too Late Powell because he's always too late. I mean, if you look at him, every time I did this, I was right 100%. He was wrong. Maybe I should go to the Fed. Am I allowed to appoint myself, Doug? I don't know. Am I allowed to appoint myself at the Fed? I do a much better job than these people. So anyway, we should be 2 points lower. It'd be nice to be 2.5 points lower. We'd be saving $800 billion, $700 billion. That's a lot of money, right? Think of for nothing, for absolutely nothing.
All right, guys. So we got to talk about the economy, which is probably my favorite subject to talk about because honestly, it's one of those subjects that I think actually has an effect on everybody's life, okay, and how we live. And Jerome Powell, the chair of the Federal Reserve, is getting a whole lot of backlash because he's making decisions about the cost of capital, the cost of money, the cost of debt in our economy that seem to be political rather than driven by the data. Even though he suggests that his decisions are driven by data, his actions suggest otherwise, right? And this is why President Trump is really, really, really upset with Jerome Powell, as you guys saw at the beginning of this video, because Jerome Powell is essentially refusing to lower interest rates, right? To lower the federal funds rate. And that's a big deal. It's a big deal because the Biden administration under Janet Yellen decided that they would refinance our debt short term, okay, instead of doing long-term financing, even when we had historically low interest rates. A very silly and unwise decision that was made by Janet Yellen. So we have essentially trillions of dollars in debt that we need to refinance this year, and it would be better for us. It would save us billions of dollars to refinance that debt at lower interest rates, okay? But Jerome Powell is refusing to lower interest rates, and that is pissing the Trump administration off because essentially it is ruining the economic plans, the economic agenda that the Trump administration has, especially when it comes to the supply side stimulus that is coming up in the big, beautiful bill. Okay. You're going to need to lower borrowing costs, or at least attempt to lower borrowing costs in order to help incentivize more spending from businesses, more investment from businesses to help get the economy going and to produce more goods for the economy. So with that being said, I want to talk about this because it seems as if Jerome Powell's decisions in regards to interest rates, again, are not driven by the data. It's driven by politics. And this is why he's getting a whole bunch of backlash. But I want to go ahead and play this clip of him explaining his recent decision, or the Fed's recent decision, to hold rates steady for right now and refuse to lower rates despite the president basically demanding that he start lowering rates. Take a look.
Mr. Chair, I wonder if you could describe for us some of those scenarios. How do you get to a place? I'm noticing that the uncertainty levels in your forecast are very high. How do you get to a place where you have the confidence in the outlook for, say, inflation and or growth or the unemployment rate? How many months does it take, and what do you want to see in the data to get to that level of confidence to actually reduce rates off the restrictive level?
So it's very, very hard to say when that will happen. We know that the time will come. It could come quickly. It could not come quickly. As long as the economy is solid, though, as long as we're seeing the kind of labor market that we have and reasonably decent growth and inflation moving down, we feel like the right thing to do is to be where we are, where our policy stance is, and just learn more. And in particular, we feel like we're going to learn a great deal more over the summer on tariffs. We hadn't expected them to show up much by now, and they haven't. And we will see whether, to the extent to which they do over coming months. And I think that's going to inform our thinking, for one thing. In addition, we'll see how the labor market progresses. So at some point it will become clear. I can't tell you exactly when that will be. And meanwhile, we'll be watching the labor market very carefully for signs of weakness and strength, and tariffs for signs of what's going to happen there. And of course, there are many developments ahead. Even in the near term, developments are expected on tariffs. So I think we don't yet know with any confidence where they will settle out. We have an estimate, and I think all estimates are now pretty close together, but it's again highly uncertain.
When you say estimate of the impact of tariffs on the core PCE, is that what it is? And could you share that?
What you start with is what's the effective tariff rate overall, and people are managing to that. But the pass-through of tariffs to consumer price inflation is a whole process that's very uncertain. As you know, there are many parties in that chain. There's the manufacturer, the exporter, the importer, the retailer, and the consumer. And each one of those is going to be trying not to be the one to pay for the tariff. But together, they will all pay for it together, or maybe one party will pay it all. But that process is very hard to predict. And we haven't been through a situation like this. And I think we have to be humble about our ability to forecast it. So that's why we need to see some actual data to make better decisions. We'd like to get some more data. And again, in the meantime, we can do that because the economy remains in solid condition.
Yeah, so I want you guys to understand just how big of a deal this is, okay? We have about $10 trillion in marketable debt that we need to refinance this year, okay? And we all understand that our debt service, the amount of money that we pay in interest, okay, every single year, is already at $1.9 trillion. And that's going to go up if we have to refinance $10 trillion worth of debt at higher rates, okay? So that's the issue. The issue is that if we have to refinance at elevated rates, then that's just going to add to the amount of interest, debt service, that we have to pay every single year, which is just going to add to the deficit. Okay, so again, this is a really big deal. And this is why Jerome Powell is getting a lot of backlash, because he's trying to justify his decision by saying, well, it's the tariffs' fault, right? The tariffs have created uncertainty. Okay, even though inflation is basically at 2%, right? I mean, we went over all the inflation reports over the past 3 months. It's basically almost at the Fed target of 2%. The economy in and of itself, the labor market is steady, right? Things aren't, too bad. But this guy is, again, refusing to lower rates, despite the fact that he was willing to do so in conditions that were not as favorable for rate cuts. Like, for example, right before the election. And this is why, again, a lot of people are giving this man backlash. They're saying, listen, what you're doing is political. You're just trying to spike Trump rather than making decisions based off the data.
It's not that too late Jerome Powell is resisting these urges from the White House. He's resisting the facts on the ground that say it's time to bring rates lower from near 20-year highs. What are those facts? Inflation's at a 4-year low. As you heard Jay Powell say yesterday, there were 3 consecutive back-to-back-to-back better than expected inflation readings. And let's not forget, President Trump's fiscal policy, energy policy, and deregulation policy all point to continued lower inflation. And so ultimately the question has to be asked, why is too late making too many excuses? Why is he keeping rates this high when the economic fundamentals do not call for it?
Next one, James. The Fed projects higher inflation next year. How much confidence do you have in their prediction, given how much they have kind of underestimated things in the past?
Yeah, they have a really awful track record, Stuart, when it comes to predicting inflation. I have very little confidence in their forecasts because their forecasts are rooted in a misunderstanding of tariffs and a complete rejection of other parts of President Trump's fiscal and economic agenda. In yesterday's Fed press conference, Powell mentioned the word tariff 31 times. He mentioned the word deregulation or regulation 0 times and mentioned the big beautiful bill 0 times. And so you have to wonder if these projections are exclusively about the Fed's bad misreading of tariffs and are not taking into account the big beautiful bill, which is disinflationary, are not taking into account drill baby drill and the widespread deregulation policy, all of which increase supply and bring down prices. These are one-sided projections that don't accurately reflect where the economy is going.
But we got no rate cut in the immediate future. Got to wait till September. Is that what's happening?
You know, we got to separate. My job is to separate what the Fed should do and what the Fed will do. President Trump is right. It is disgraceful that Powell is keeping rates this high despite economic data that suggests everything to the contrary, that rates should be lowered to at least 3%. That's what the Fed's neutral rate was restated as yesterday afternoon. Likely, we won't probably see anything until September, but that is to the disappointment of many workers, families who want to see relief on their mortgages and credit card bills.
James Fishback, thank you very much for joining us. We appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah. So again, I want you guys to understand, Jerome Powell's logic here is that, well, we think that tariffs are going to cause inflation, even though we haven't seen the inflation yet. We think that tariffs are going to cause inflation, so therefore we're not going to lower interest rates, right? That's basically what they're saying. We're not lowering interest rates because of Trump's policies that we don't like, which, again, you know, when you look at the data, have not affected the economy in ways that this guy has predicted. And this dude has basically been wrong for the last 4 to 5 years straight. This is the same dude that said inflation was transitory, right? When we spent trillions of dollars, you know, actual fiscal and monetary policy that is inflationary, right? When we were doing that under the Democrats, inflation is transitory. Him and Janet Yellen came out here and said inflation is transitory, right? Okay. Now, he's saying under the Trump administration that, well, the lack of inflation is transitory, right? That's essentially, that's what he's doing. Okay. So again, it's one of those things where my issue with Jerome Powell is the fact that clearly he's not being ideologically consistent, right? This is political. And I'm going to explain exactly what I'm talking about here because there are different economic schools of thought in regards to what Jerome Powell should do with interest rates, okay? And I want to explain a couple of them. But first, I want to go ahead and play this clip so we can get a little bit of a deeper understanding into the criticism that Jerome Powell is getting on this issue.
Well, another Federal Reserve get-together without a rate cut, and the president's patience is wearing very thin. Watch.
If the Fed would ever lower rates, you know, would buy debt for a lot less. It's a shame. This guy, do you ever have a guy that's not a smart person and you're dealing with him and you have to, he's worried about inflation. I said, that's right. If there's inflation in 6 months or 9 months, you lower the rates or you raise the rates. No inflation. And it's going to get even more so. I know what I'm doing. So we have a stupid person, frankly, at the Fed.
He's also a partisan political hack, Jay Powell, standing firm in the choice not to lower interest rates yet again. Hadn't done it all year. Did it before the election last year, though. Big time. He doesn't seem to have the same urgency that he did, say, back in, September of 2024, and then again in November.
There an election back then? Yeah, I remember.
Yeah, so again, this is the problem, okay? Because there are two schools of thoughts that I want to talk about, right? Economic schools of thought that I want to talk about here, right? In regards to the decision from Jerome Powell, right? There's the Austrian perspective, okay, on the rate cuts, which would be, well, abolish the Fed and go back to the gold standard, right? That is what the Austrian would say in this situation. They would say interest rates should be set by the market, not the government, okay? But interest rates right now being elevated is a sign that the government has overspent, right? That the government overspending has led to the high interest rate environment, and having to refinance debt at such high rates is just a consequence of the government overspending that you got to deal with, which should incentivize the government to cut spending and to start to save more money, right? To incentivize more saving, okay? And for businesses to make smarter and wiser investments, because the hurdle rate that businesses need to overcome in order to make investments is a lot higher when interest rates are elevated, right? So when companies think about certain projects, right, or investing in certain projects, they come up with essentially discount rates, right? They say, okay, well, what is the risk-free rate? How much money can I earn on my cash just, sitting in treasuries or whatever, right? The higher that rate is, that means that the return on investment for whatever projects that they're thinking about doing or whatever investments that they're thinking about making has to be higher than the interest rate, right? The risk-free rate. And if the risk-free rate is high, then that means that businesses generally are going to invest in less projects. They're going to save that money instead if they feel like the project does not have a risk-adjusted return that justifies moving forward with the project versus just letting your money sit in cash, right? I just want people to kind of understand it and to learn about how this stuff works, right? So again, I don't want to over-explain it. I don't want to make it too complicated, but I'm just letting you guys know this is kind of certain ways to look at this, okay? So the thing is that if Jerome Powell actually was looking at it from that perspective, if he was consistent ideologically across the board when it came to this idea that, hey, you know what? We have to continue to increase interest rates or to keep interest rates steady until inflation hits the 2% goal, then I would have no criticisms of Jerome Powell. And I in fact would say that he is correct, right? That if he was actually consistent, right, with his analysis, then we should have gotten more rate increases under the Biden administration until inflation got back under 2%. We're closer today to inflation being under 2%, according to the government's own statistics, right? According to the Fed's preferred inflation report, right? The PCE report, okay? That's their preferred report, right? According to their own data, we're closer today to the Fed's target 2% rate than we were right before the election. But as you can see here, Powell decided to do a 50 basis point drop before the election, right before the election. So from a Keynesian perspective, which is the perspective that Powell is coming from, by the way, right? Again, this is why I'm explaining it to you like this. He's looking at it from a Keynesian perspective. From a Keynesian perspective, he has more justification to lower interest rates today than he did back before the election. But he lowered interest rates, a 50 basis point drop, okay? Half a percentage point before the election, because that lowered the cost of capital, lowered borrowing. What does lowered borrowing do for the economy? Well, just like I explained to you guys, if higher rates make it harder or make it more expensive to borrow money, lower rates make it less expensive to borrow money, right? And if it's less expensive to borrow money, that provides juice to the economy, right? It gets consumer spending because consumers can borrow money at lower rates, right? Which again incentivizes consumers to spend, it incentivizes businesses to spend, GDP growth goes up. So clearly, what you have here is Jerome Powell making decisions that are not really consistent with the data, because the data today suggests that rate cuts are more appropriate than it did before the election. In fact, I went on record to say before the election, when this was first announced, I said, this is a mistake. The reason why is because he's lowering rates too early. The data does not suggest that he should lower rates. Despite the fact that President Trump was calling for rate cuts, I said, no, they should not be cutting rates right now because inflation is still elevated. And then guess what? Inflation started to tick back up after that rate cut, as I predicted, okay? But now, at this point in time, from a Keynesian perspective, which again is the perspective that he's coming from here, he should be lowering rates. It's one thing if he was an Austrian and he was consistent across the board in regards to elevated interest rates, keeping them steady. Again, if he would have increased interest rates to where they should have been, which should have been the rate of inflation or above the rate of inflation during Biden's term, we would have went into a recession and we would have stopped out inflation a long time ago, right? We would have had this problem solved. But see, what they tried to do is that they basically tried to rig Biden's economy in a way to avoid a recession on paper, even though Biden's economy did go into a recession, and then they all of a sudden changed the definition of recession. Now they've changed it back to 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth now that Trump is in office, right? They've now changed the definition of recession back to that. But again, what he tried to do is that he tried to engineer what they call a soft landing, and that basically led us into a situation of stagflation, right? It led us in a situation where we still have this elevated inflation that we could have took care of had he been willing to actually put the economy in a real recession under Biden. But because he didn't do that and then decided to lower interest rates right before the election in order to help juice the economy on behalf of the Democrats, on behalf of Kamala Harris, that is why we're in the situation that we're in. And now we're in a situation where it actually makes sense, again, from a Keynesian perspective, if that's the perspective that you're looking at it from, to lower rates. Then he don't want to do it. All of a sudden, we don't want to do it. It's the tariffs. The tariffs are the problem, right? But we're looking at the data. We don't know, right? We don't know. So we're just not going to do anything. You're just sticking it to Trump. That's what he's doing. Now, again, there are pros and cons to, lowering the rates, okay, or keeping them steady. If he does decide to lower rates, I don't think he should do what Trump is suggesting that he do, which is to lower rates by like 250 basis points. That would be like, that's like ridiculous, right? He should not do that. And that also could backfire in the sense that the 10-year yield is the market rate, and it's not a one-to-one movement with the federal funds rate, right? So the market rate, the 10-year rate, if the federal funds rate drops by 2.5 percentage points overnight, then that actually could lead to the 10-year yield going up because investors could see that as inflationary, right? And that's why he probably should not do a large rate cut, but he probably should have started doing tiny rate cuts, maybe 10 basis points. He probably should have started doing that a few months ago, right? That's probably what he should have started doing. But the fact is that he's not doing anything at all, and not doing anything at all is putting us in a very interesting situation when it comes to debt refinancing, okay? And that's a problem, right? A big problem that was put on us by the bad decisions of the Biden administration when it comes to refinancing debt at short-term rates, right? Rather than long-term, we had historically low interest rates. It didn't make any sense, right? It made no sense whatsoever. So now we're stuck with a high interest rate environment and trillions of dollars in debt that need to be refinanced. So I hope people kind of understand where I'm coming from with this.
Remember that the Federal Reserve keeping its key borrowing rate at a range between 4.25 and 4.5%. That's very high.
Jay Powell's inaction may be contributing to how Americans feel about the economy, though things are looking up. 31% rate the economy as excellent or good.
And if Powell won't lower rates, President Trump joked, well, he just might have to nominate himself as Fed chair to get the job done.
For more, let's bring in Unleash Prosperity Senior Fellow and the Heritage Foundation Chief Economist, E.J. Antoni. And those interest on the debt numbers I got from E.J., by the way. Thank you, E.J. What is wrong with Powell? What was his excuse? I'm not going to take David's steam because David was angrier than I was about the decision today. But what, the weakening dollar is his reason? It just seems that he's dug in for political purposes.
Well, Dagan, if that's the reason, then what about the dollar weakening under Biden? Why weren't we hiking rates much sooner and by much more? Why were we having any conversation about cutting rates back in the autumn? This makes no sense. As both you and David were saying, he is purely political. Look, the guy is not an economist. He's an attorney, and frankly, a second-rate one at that. He has no business being in the position that he's in, where he's the one determining the most important price in the entire economy, the price of money.
Yeah. And then.
Yeah, I agree with that. Right. I agree with that 100%. I personally think that Powell is acting politically. Okay. Now, what President Trump is probably going to end up trying to do is this strategy called the shadow chair strategy, where he basically says, hey, this is who I'm going to nominate as the next chair of the Federal Reserve. And then they issue what they call forward guidance, right? Basically saying that, hey, we expect interest rates to come down in the future. And maybe, right? Maybe, just maybe, that will flow into the market rate, right? It will flow into how it affects the 10-year yield, and that will drive down rates for the 10-year, okay? Which, again, is the rate that most of the economy is kind of based on, right? Mortgages and things like that. So I think that's what he's going to do next, right? I think that he's going to come out and say, hey, this is going to be my next Fed chair. And the next Fed chair is going to start to issue guidance before Jerome Powell is out of office. And that's going to set expectations for the market. And maybe that will drive down rates. This is why, again, I really believe that, if they do it, it needs to be small rate cuts, because hopefully that doesn't spook the market. Because if you do rate cuts too large, too fast, then you can actually get the opposite that occurs. The long end of the yield curve could actually go up, right? Could actually increase. And you don't want that, right? You can get the opposite effect if rates are cut too fast, okay? So, again, we're going to see. I'm just saying the whole point of this video is that this guy, again, is in charge of probably one of the most important aspects of the economy. And clearly he's playing politics. And it's not based off data. It's based off, just screw Trump, right? And that's what's happening here. And they claim that, the Fed is supposed to be independent, right? They're supposed to be independent. This guy is not acting in a way that's independent, right? He's acting like a Democrat activist trying to undermine the economy on behalf of Democrats in order to stick it to Trump. But hey, let me know what you guys think. Make sure you like, comment, and subscribe. Most importantly, share a Black conservative perspective. Peace.